late 40s, is one of the most important. In particular, two of the most famous designers were involved in it. That is Charles Eames, who, while not really an architect, he was producing buildings with his wife Ray. Ray and Charles were an important team, not only designing buildings, because you could design and still can design houses without having a license in most states, if they're small, like these houses were. But the Eames were also incredibly important industrial designers. They designed furniture, they designed lamps, rugs, even extensive work in the graphic arts and in the design of toys. If you have an opportunity to get down to the Milwaukee Art Museum in the near future, the current changing exhibition down there called Play features extensive exhibits of Ray and Charles Eames toys for children. And some of them are interesting enough for adults, by the way. So, but if you have kids or grandchildren, getting down there with them because they have some play areas where they can presumably destroy Eames' precious artifacts. But another important designer was Eero Saarinen. Eero Saarinen was the son of Elio Saarinen, who was running a great college of architecture near Detroit. And his young son was first working with his father, but quickly branched out to become maybe the most important architect in the country at mid-century. And Saarinen designed buildings all over the nation here, and I'll look at one in a moment. But here he worked on this simple house with Eames, completed in 1949 in Southern California. And this too features a steel frame, which was unusual at the time, and was certainly influenced by the Europeans like Mies, who had been doing steel frame houses before this time. The steel frame allowed a kind of openness to the landscape that a wood frame building didn't allow. You can see this vast glass wall here, and check out the size of the columns, right? Teeny little pencil-like steel columns that could hold the building up and allow this kind of openness that, again, wood frame generally don't allow. Also, interestingly, is that the glass wall here is a steel-framed glass wall, such that the mullions themselves that hold the glass together could be really teeny little profiles. And again, open up a whole series of rooms centered around hearth, as you can get a sense here, and have these open views to the landscape. By the way, this form of a building, kind of a frame in inverted U shape, if you had 10 young architects today, like get right out of architecture school, sketch a building, 8 of them would sketch this. You know, this is a form that we first got to see in the 1940s, early 1950s, at mid-century, and it's really back. Interestingly, like Wright, the Eames here have been able to provide a kind of warmth to this house, mainly through the use of wood. Look at the wood ceiling here, that the European moderns didn't do. And so this thing has some of the harshness of a Mies house, but it's much warmer in the way it incorporated wood. I wanted to show you the kind of drawings that architects and designers did at mid-century. Here, for example, is a drawing by Eames and by Saarinen of this particular house. Here is the frame element there. The little skinny columns are up here. There's that glass wall that faced the landscape up here. And here you can see the kitchen, open to a dining area, open to a living area, open to a kind of den family area here, and even with openness with a sliding door to one of the bedrooms, but with private rooms that are elsewhere in the house. Not only did Eames and Saarinen design the house, but as I mentioned, they worked on many of the objects that furnished the house. And so you can see, for example, in the background is a set of tulip table and chairs by Saarinen, which was at that point already in mass production, I think. I own one of them, and one set of them in a mid-century modern house my dad designed. And just let's say that collecting antiques from mid-century modern is a big new thing. So that stuff you have in your basement, let me tell you, look at it real good.
Call us.
Yeah, right. Saarinen, and I think Saarinen, you can see a steel framed, they call it steel sash window, that allowed bigger pieces of glass and allowed the mullions to be much smaller than in a wood system. All these full curtain walls, as they call them here. There's something that many mid-century buildings feature, these extensive glass walls. And one of the challenges in preserving these buildings and in historic preservation in general with these buildings is what to do with all the windows, right? Especially as in many of these buildings, these walls are reaching the end of their life. So I'm gonna take a little discursion for a moment. Please excuse me if I whip your head around on this. But I wanted to show you another building by Saarinen, one of the most important in the country, and I think that Wisconsin's most important mid-century modern building, which is the Milwaukee County War Memorial by Eero Saarinen, dating from right around 1955. At this time, Saarinen had taken his place in 1955 as America's most important practicing architect, and he had commissions from one end of the country to the other. If there was a big commission in this country, his name was considered as the architect for it. And you can get a sense of some of the things that he's working on. On the lakefront here, this building floats up above this open courtyard. So when you stand here, these people are looking over this sloping bluff and out to Lake Michigan. So again, there's this focus on this open and expansive connection to the landscape that architecture hadn't seen so much of before. Also here are these steel sash windows, not only in the main building, in these big glass areas, but on areas like this stairway here. And I wanted to, as a digression, talk about how the windows were made in a building like this one, and how difficult in some ways they are to preserve, but how important it is to preserve the original windows in many of these mid-century buildings. Because I think there's often nothing worse you can do to a historic building than carelessly trashing the old windows, throwing them in the dump, and then bringing in some inappropriate windows. You can really wreck any historic building that way. That's the biggest way historic buildings are wrecked, sadly. And so I had an opportunity in the last 2 years to be the lead architect in the restoration of all the Saarinen glass that you see here. And I want you to know that all the architects that Milwaukee County had talked to before I came on the scene had said, there's no way to fix this old steel sash and glass, single pane glass wall. You have to rip it all off, and you got to put all new windows on this thing, aluminum, mullions, and we should use bigger pieces of glass, and just off-the-shelf aluminum mullions, right? There's no way to restore this thing at all, they said. And I came to the interview and said, oh, this is Wisconsin's most important mid-century modern historic building. I said, if you can't figure out how to restore this one, in just a few years, you and Milwaukee County will look really bad for having ruined an important historic building. And they hadn't heard that before, right? They hadn't heard that a mid-century modern building needed the same careful historic preservation as a Victorian building, but they heard it from me. And I also showed them a way that we could, with the help of my team, led by Russ Drury, actually, an important architect I work with, to figure out a way to thermally turn a single pane glass wall into an insulating glass wall and not affect the appearance of the work. And most of these buildings at mid-century, as many of you know, were all glazed with a single layer of quarter-inch glass. And, you know, it got a little chilly last night. But that was the technology that they were working with. They hadn't really developed double pane glass with argon or xenon in between the two panes of glass that comprises all residential glass today, or all institutional commercial glass. So the question is, how do you fix a thing like this, right? Also, a lot of the steel members were rusting and corroding. And that led a lot of architects to say, you got to rip it all off, you got to throw it all out. Well, you don't. We took all of the 1/4-inch glass out of this wall, and we steam blasted the old paint and rust off, and we found that we only had to repair about 2% of the rusted steel members, mainly right at the extreme bottom of this. And a lot of these cleaned up with blasting, and a few we found they had rusted through, and we removed them and put new steel bars in. And then we painted these all in place. And let me tell you, the paint quality and paint research done in the last 50 years has come a long way. In particular, the use of zinc powder-rich paints. It's powdered zinc metal that makes for a really corrosion-resistant paint. And they didn't have that available to them at mid-century. And so we have great paints that are available here. And while I'm not using the same paint, we had paint sampling done, and this is the original color that Saarinen had this wall painted. And so, you know, I'm interested in the preservation to the extent of looking down at the lowest level of paint, having that color analyzed, and using that as a new paint color to have a wall that, if Saarinen could be brought back today, and maybe it's a gruesome thought, he might not notice that anything has changed here. But the real question is with regard to the glass. And this is a plan of one of Saarinen's mullions. And it was a series of steel fins that resisted wind loading. And this is how the original 1/4-inch glass was placed in the frame with glazier's putty right here. And then there were screws that held that stop in, that held the glass and the putty in place. And so this was part of the reason that people said you can't, there's no way you can double the weight of the glass on this. This whole structure was cantilevered, and there was great concern with doubling the weight. A lot of your wood frames in old mid-century houses also can't take the doubling of the weight of the glass. But thank goodness, there are a number of companies, 2 of them right now, that are making a 1/4-inch thick insulated piece of glass. And what it is, it's called vacuum insulated glass. There are 2 1/8-inch pieces of glass are right around that. And they're held apart by teeny little plastic studs about the size of a thick human hair, right? And then the cavity in between these 2 pieces of glasses has all the air sucked out of it, and it's a virtual vacuum. And it's pressing the 2 pieces of glass together, held apart by the studs. The studs are so teeny you can't see them. Right? And this is amazing because, for example, like insulating glass here that we might have in this school as a glass replacement might have an R value of, you know, R1 or 1.5. It's not a very good insulator, right? This stuff is R11. You know, with your thermos bottle that keeps your coffee warm. Don't you wish you had some right now? Keeps your coffee warm with a vacuum, right? They're doing this in windows now. And so we did this here in Milwaukee, here in Wisconsin, and this is actually happens to be by a company from England called Pilkington, Pilkington. Pilkington, one of the world's great glass houses, and this is their product called Spacia. But also Guardian Glass also is making a very thin insulated vacuum glass. And so you can take out 1/4-inch glass from steel stops or from wood stops and reglaze it with 1/4-inch thick insulating glass and not affect the appearance of the building at all, keep all the original mullions, and that's the kind of thing I recommend for you. And by the way, the real reason I won this job is we did this cheaper than an aluminum replacement We kept all the frames. We didn't build any new ones. We just sandblasted them off or steam blasted them off and put new glass in. That's what we did. And the bids came in cheaper than the crummy aluminum replacement that would have ruined the Saarinen. So here's a reproduction photograph from the same perspective that the great photographer Ezra Stoller, who was a photographer of choice for mid-century modern architects, he took this photo in 1955. We took it again. This stairway, for example, looks exactly the way it did in 1955. And it probably now set for 75 years before someone tells them they have to tear it all off again. Pretty striking. And I'm happy to say that it looks like I did nothing. But back to the case study houses. Here's the living room of that Eames and Saarinen house. Look at again, the surprising focus on a hearth again. And this, we also start to see these multi-level effects in this house that I think influence the planning of many mid-century modern houses, that there might be slightly different floor levels on the first floor of a house, even establishing places that we could sit on the steps as we move from one level to another with pillows, places where kids could play, and a real nightmare for 100-year-olds, by the way, I would guess, right? Oh, he's down the steps again. And I'm walking with a cane, so I feel you. I got the picture. Other case study houses, like number 1, were really important in their influence all around the nation. Number 6 from 1952 by great architect Craig Elwood, who worked out in California. And you start to see the ornamental uses of masonry, actually several of them here, ornamental limestone work and ornamental brickwork, and the use of steel frame, and again, the idea of these openings from house out to the landscapes. Now here's a picture for you, I mean, if this doesn't look like Jack and Jackie, right? Just fantastic photo of what this life was supposed to be like out in the exurbs, right? And this idea of this outdoor living, the opportunity to have a pool, open living spaces, gathering around a family hearth that moved out to the landscape. Once again, a house that features the steel frame, unlike houses of generations before that. I wanted to mention another community, like Miller's Bay here, that is more famous, but actually more endangered. And that's something that if some of you are snowbirds, I want to advise you to head down to Sarasota, Florida, and see the work of the Sarasota School of Architecture. So at mid-century, after World War II, there were a group of architects who came together and met frequently and talked about the work and inspired each other to really do a whole collection, a very large number of mid-century modern buildings in and around the outskirts of Sarasota, Florida, and led by Ralph Twitchell, who was the sort of father of the school out there. But there were many architects who were working on this, and they produced a really wide range of very beautiful buildings. And you can get a sense of the openness of these, the use of metal frames, the movement from an interior, opening up huge sliding windows or doors to step out into a terrace that appears to be both inside and outside here. This one all covered with mosquito netting for obvious reasons if you've ever fly fished around Sarasota like I have. Biting gnats as well, but beautiful buildings. And sadly today, I think disappearing every year. A lot of these buildings are in the harsh Florida climate. A lot of salt air and salt water. extremely harsh solar radiation and ultraviolet degradation of any non-metal material. So many of these houses are in rough shape, and they're being torn down also due to the pressure to build multi-million-dollar mansions on the seacoast sites in Sarasota and around the environs there. And so take a look at these houses while you still can, because it suggests that these things might not be around forever. I think there's real concern in Sarasota today that their architectural legacy is quickly disappearing. Several of them disappear every year by demolition to build new houses. And they've tried to start a movement to preserve these buildings. And it does suggest that you might have to take action here, and I think you have started that process, because some of these beautiful buildings, they might not be around forever. The important American architect Paul Rudolph, who became an important architecture faculty at Yale University with a nationwide practice, he got his start in Sarasota, and he built a number of important houses there. And he also built some schools in the mid-century modern style, some other public buildings. So they have diverse building types all built here. This is his most famous, the Umbrella House, actually named after this shaded courtyard that exists outside the house. He was someone who appreciated how hot it can really get in Florida, and that being outside in the shade could be an important feature. And it also suggests the mid-century modern could change enough for the climate that when you needed to shade a courtyard, these architects were figuring out how to do that sort of work. I also just wanted to look at some of what are, to me anyways, some of the most strikingly interesting houses that you have here in town. And please don't be offended if I don't show your house. I couldn't help but noticing that anything breakable at the front of the hall here is covered with fencing. So it's evident at some point people are throwing things up towards the front. So, I don't know. So I just wanted to show, and I'm sure you're much more familiar with these than I am, but I think you can get a sense here of the uniqueness and modernity of this building. The flat roof and the extremely long overhangs, and how extremely thin these are. I mean, this looks like a 6-inch piece of construction here that at points is cantilevering out 8 or so feet out. These are the kind of cantilevers that Frank Lloyd Wright and Mies were after. And they make for a really striking piece of architecture. And they also today make for really good solar shading of large glass areas. Such that you can have glass walls that are this expansive, and these deep overhangs prevent the solar gain that would produce an unlivable building if you didn't have these overhangs. Also, the masonry work here, the representation of this hearth again, and this is really the dominant figure of this house, right? It's also done in what's called stack bond. You'll notice that most masonry is done in what's called running bond. Running bond is the pattern you can see in the block wall right there, where each successive horizontal course is slipped 50% from the course below it. But at some point, mid-century modern architects wanted to have a more modern thing. And they started asking masons, can we not slip them? Can we just stack one brick or stone vertically on top of each other? So you see the stack bonding really common in a lot of these mid-century modern houses. Very handsome house. Another really beautiful house here, again, that features these sort of razor-thin, long cantilever eaves that give this house a lot of character, and also the really extensively large glazed areas. It's interesting, too, you can get a sense that there's some landscape stepping that's going on here, and probably inside the house as well. But another feature in many of the mid-century modern houses is the establishment of separate, almost pavilions to make up a house. And that's something that you'll see in mid-century modern buildings that you didn't frequently see in pre-modern houses. And you get that here, and we'll see it in some of these other houses as well. You know, it shows you how architects could get carried away with the hearth idea, right? You know, in which this house is like, this hearth is, in this case, it's big enough for like a house that's like 3 times this size, right? But it shows you that I think in mid-century they were after houses that had a distinctive character, and they weren't afraid to produce a house that had, let's call it a little strangeness to it. And I mean that in a good way, actually. One very important European architectural critic said back in the 19th century, he says, there is no beauty without a certain strangeness. That is, for something to be really interesting, for something to be really beautiful, it needs to be outside of a normative condition, like of a house. And I think that's the kind of thing you see here. It's a compelling and interesting feature. I also wanted to mention that there was a distinctive color palette that mid-century designers worked in. And it's nice to see that the mustards that were really important to mid-century designers are not lost here in Millers Bay, right? That some of these somewhat vibrant and strange color schemes that they loved at mid-century, they appear to be back. And not only can you go online and look up Accent 68 and see the favorite colors for houses from 1968, right? But today, I think all of the major paint manufacturers, they will have they're calling this one their suburban modern color scheme, right? So they have collected the colors that were common back for mid-century modern, and it can really help you and serve as a guide for how to make your house garishly wild. And but I would definitely recommend when you're going to look at repainting these buildings and even painting the interiors, just like throw yourselves into this stuff. That is just say, yeah, I have one of these houses. I'm gonna swim in it. I'm gonna go with this thing, and even if there's some of the colors that you don't absolutely love, that's my recommendation, and try to keep these houses as intact and as original as you can. I mentioned, for example, the similarities of some of the interests of showing beam ends, for example, showing how the building was made, of the arts and crafts movement that come through in some of your Millers Bay buildings as well. Another house done, long horizontal stretching prairie thing, again all done with stack bond brick. And it's also interesting that as Frank Lloyd Wright did, he wasn't comfortable with bricks like that, which are only 8 inches long, right? When Frank Lloyd Wright worked, he was looking for bricks that would be 12 or 16 inches long. So he actually had some custom bricks made for him, or would search out bricks that had longer horizontal proportion. And that's what we're looking at in this house here, some of these Roman bricks. So they're interested in having bricks that were as long and horizontal as the house itself. So we're looking at a way to blend the detail of the building with the building as a whole. And they look for bricks that were as long and horizontal and stretched, or even stones that were long and horizontal and stretched as the buildings were. I'm sorry. You can also see, in something I've talked about earlier, in which while the whole thing, some of these buildings reads as a single building, all under this these broad eaves of this flat gable, right? there's a sense that there are like separate elements underneath that gable. Like the garage reads as a little pavilion. This hearth element or stone wall reads as another. That reads as another thing, right? And that's not the way houses were done before this period. In some ways, I have even wondered if you recall that early meaning of the word ranch, which was the collection of farm huts. So the idea that there was a collection of smaller buildings that were arranged around the open space inside and outside of the house. Again, it's nice to see some of these really dark navies that were original to the arts and crafts color scheme. That's one of those 9 colors I showed originally, still in use here in Williams Bay, like that beautiful dark navy. I mentioned limestone a couple times, and you can see these, a lot of houses, like this very beautiful house that has some beautiful Wisconsin limestones, and we have a lot of limestone quarries here in Wisconsin from which these houses were pulled. And also notice the pulled out stones here, and the only stones that are pulled out are the very long horizontal ones. So that they wanted to emphasize this long horizontal character that also makes up the house itself. One of the other things I think shows up here that's in many of these Wisconsin mid-century modern ranch houses are the use of some rainforest woods like teak and mahogany. They were very big on these fairly exotic hardwoods. And I'm sure that maintaining some of these woods is like owning a sailboat, you know? But I think it's worth doing, and it would be great to see that, like if you have a door, a mahogany door in these houses that's finally giving up the ghost after 60, 70 years, it would be great to see a new door made out of teak or mahogany, because there are craftspeople here in Wisconsin who have no trouble at all rebuilding these doors, and we would love to see that special features like that were maintained and restored or replaced in kind, if that was required. It's also interesting to see in some of these houses that there are areas, and I don't know if the shutters are original, I suspect not, you know, in which it goes from a very standard domestic reading, and then other parts of the house slide off as a big shed and have clearly contemporary modernist leanings. So there are the interesting fusions of styles in some of these houses. And architects playing with wild and interesting shapes, stacked on masonry again, I think. No, this is running on, sorry, but ultra long and horizontal bricks. So I think with that, I want to close up and thank you for inviting me here today, and hopefully I've given you some sense of the importance of this architectural movement and its origins as well, and how some of the forms came here to Williams Bay. So thank you. I can take questions if you want. Yeah, are there any questions? If not, I could take questions up here.
Do you recommend any neighborhood zoning? Is there any benefits of being a mid-century neighborhood to protect some of these buildings from not getting torn down, or can they do that?
Yeah, hopefully you heard that. The question is, would I recommend some sort of neighborhood zoning, like historic preservation ordinance, to protect the neighborhood? And I would say that I do believe in that. You know, the city of Milwaukee has, I think, over 20 historic districts right now, and I was involved in that commission of reviewing changes being made to houses, right? And I'm sorry I don't have it here for you today, but one of the really interesting things was that the historic preservation officer, the staff we had a fantastic before and after slide sequence. He had a 1995 photograph of 2 identical Victorian homes that existed in Milwaukee, built by the same builder in the same year, identical still 100 years later in 1995. But by 2000, one of the houses had been extensively renovated. For example, the sloping lawn, they put a concrete block retaining wall up front. they tore off the Victorian porch and they built a new treated wood porch. You know, they put all new vinyl windows in, change after change after change, and I believe they invested somewhere about $100,000 in all the work they did in renovating the house. What our preservation officer did, he pulled from 1995 the tax assessments of the two houses, the property value assessments, and in 1995 they were equal. In 2000s, just 5 years later, after one house had been renovated, and they put $100,000 of investment into the house, it was worth $25,000 less than the old house. That is, careless renovation had ruined the property value of the renovated house. That is, they had put $100,000 in, and they had lost $25,000 of value. So that can happen to a whole neighborhood. Careless renovations can ruin the property value of nearby houses as well. I understand that it can be a controversial thing, but I really believe in it. And I think I know that some of your houses are capable of being on the National Register, right? Have you considered a National Register district?
We've shown the Wisconsin Historical Society in the neighborhood, and they
Sure.
send us pictures of
Sure.
these houses that are
So
significant.
just to describe what a National Register Historic District is about, if you can get yourself on the National Register of Historic Places as a district, you have then what I would call all carrot and no stick. That is, the National Register is not a binding preservation requirement. There are none. You can tear down your house tomorrow. You can diminish it by $25,000 value with crappy renovations next week, right? However, if you're in the National Register in a district and you carefully restore your home, you get 20% federal tax credits and some state of Wisconsin tax credit. I happen to be in a federal historic district. I'm in the North Point North Historic District on the east side of Milwaukee, in the North Water Tower District, and I'm happy to say my architect wife just renovated the heck out of our house. And out of every $1,000 we spent on historic preservation, I think we got 300 back.
Nice.
Yeah, nice. Especially when some of the stucco work on our house, is in the $30,000 range, right? Getting 30% of that back in tax credits is a valuable thing. So I would really recommend considering a federal historic district. Just to be clear, the feds in jackboots do not come into your neighborhood. You can change your house anytime you want, but if you do it right, you can get tax credits for it, and it's a great value. Local designation, and I don't know if you have a historic preservation ordinance here in Oshkosh, do you?
We do, but there's no two.
Yeah. So, it's possible a local district, and I recommend those too. I think when you have a valuable historic resource, trying to maintain that. The U.S. Supreme Court has again and again found that sort of zoning to be reasonable and well within constitutional rights. And so I'd recommend both. But thank you so much for coming to today, Historic. I appreciate
Thank you, Mr. Shields. That was really great. And before you all leave, I just want to also thank the City of Oshkosh for the continued support of our neighborhood and things that we do here. Also, thank Steve Wiley. Mr. Shields is actually his professor when he was getting his graduate degree, and so he's the one who recommended him to us. Also, I don't know if Kevin Rao is here. Are you here, Kevin? Kevin is one of our neighbors, and he designed the flyer for us. Kevin is the owner of Best Impressions Artisanal Printing downtown. Also like to thank Jim and Jane Hoffman. Jim spent a lot of last winter doing research on our neighborhood, and if you look at that map over there, he found when every single house in this neighborhood was built, and then Jane wrote it on the map, so it's really nice. So take a look at that before you leave. Also like to thank Sandy Prunty, she's right here. She's one of my bridge partners. She's the owner of Atomic Cats downtown. They sell mid-century furnishings, and she helped us advertise this on her Facebook, so we appreciate that, Sandy.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Chuck and Wendy, for all your research, and thank you, Adam Kimball, for helping us with the technology. We couldn't do it without you. And also thank the Social Committee for their coffee and donuts that they provided, and the Streetscape Committee and Beautification Committee who made this all possible. And thank you for coming. We hope you enjoyed it.